So I'm going to start recording. So are there any questions about that, about what we're going to be doing on this upcoming Tuesday's class? It'll be, again, the thing is, it'd be great if you came to Tuesday's class and you've got a tiny working demo of a tiny part of your model that you can are just ready to demonstrate. And if you demonstrate it within the first couple of minutes of the class, you're done and you can leave, or you can hang out there and work with your team for the rest of the class. And if you have issues, you can call us over and hopefully we can help you with those issues. But if you do at least bring something to the classroom, even if you are having problems, we can help you work through those problems initially. And if you aren't able to demo your tiny working model, by the end of the class, you'll be able to upload it. So are there any questions about that, about what we're going to be doing on this upcoming Tuesday, next week? And that, by the way, is the last deliverable of this final project until your final report and your final presentations, which are due the Wednesday of the last week of class. So this mainly is just a checking in step where we just make sure that, like, the last thing we want is for the last week of class, everybody to try to go into their presentations and have a bunch of errors when they try to run their models. And the only thing that they can present by the deadline is just errors from VinSim. So we're trying to make sure that you aren't in that position, so that when you do present at the end of the semester, the last week of class, that you'll have something that's meaningful. Okay. All right, great. Then the only other reminders that I have here are that, we've got only 2 more chapters left in the book. And so lecture F2, which will be a week from today, that's chapter 9. So make sure you read chapter 9 and do the assignments of that in a week. And then chapter 10 will follow very quickly after that, I think in the Tuesday of the week after that, if I remember my schedule correctly. And then that will be the last chapter of the book that we will handle. And then there'll be a lecture from me on more advanced topics, particularly chaos. And so what it means to have a chaotic system in dynamical systems, and randomness. When do you use randomness in these systems? And then Eric will be giving us a lecture on some work that is relevant to him, that helps show how these quantitative type models, not necessarily exactly what we'll be doing in this class, but related to what we're doing in this class, actually do meet the road. So where the rubber meets the road there, where you've got real world experiments and quantitative analysis of data from those experiments and so on. So we'll talk about that then. And there's no more homework assignments after this assignment E5 is turned in. So it's pretty much just the reading assignments and the final project are all that's left once you get this E5 done. So, all right, so before we start into today's lecture, are there any administrative type questions that I can address? Okay. So I will stop this share and start sharing today's business. All right, so I think, all right, so it looks like we're good, but I'm not getting the little green. Can you put in the chat, confirm me if you see the title slide for this chapter 8? I just want to make sure Zoom sort of acted a little funny there when I shared that screen. Okay, good, thank you. All right, so this chapter 8, I hope was an interesting chapter to you. Based on the comments I got in perusal, it looked like a lot of people were maybe didn't know a lot about how OPEC has kind of control over the market, and it sounds like people were engaging with that material, and I was really excited to see that. So this chapter is a real world example of some modeling done by Morecroft and his consulting group with major oil companies. And so the idea here is that they wanted to model the dynamics of an entire industry, a worldwide industry. So that's thousands of firms and billions of customers. And so we're showing this here not just to teach you about oil, but which is interesting from a sustainability perspective, but it's also to just teach you how to model these things at huge scale, where you might go into it thinking you need to model every tiny little detail, but in reality, you just need to focus in on particular important parts of the model, and then maybe coarse grain out other parts so that they can be represented by kind of rougher surrogates, because you don't actually care about the underlying details. So the basic dynamical modeling tip that was supposed to come out of this chapter is to learn to adopt the appropriate perspective when you're coming up with your modeling. So when you're modeling an entire industry, you might go into it thinking of, well, who are all of the firms that play a role in the industry? And in reality, when you start digging down into it, they're not only the giant oil providers, but there are little oil providers as well. And it may not make sense to model all of those firms individually if a lot of those firms are kind of copies of each other. It's like, yeah, this firm has more access to oil than this firm, but in the end of it, they don't those individual firms may not have enough oil to drive the market by themselves. And so they are just responding to market signals. So really, I could kind of group them all in together into one just sort of generic independent oil providers group. And I will end up getting the same dynamics that I did get from like the real world. So that is something that we're going to dial into a little bit here. But before we get to that, then, an important question is saying, well, why bother? Why should we model in a computer simulation the dynamics of an entire industry like oil? And so in this real world case, the Royal Dutch Shell, or Shell Oil, got together with Morecroft, and because they were interested in scenario planning, they were interested in strategically thinking about how to move their company forward and how their company might interact with other things that are going on in the world, because oil really does dial into worldwide phenomena. So they wanted to become more agile and be able to recognize significant industry trends while they're happening and maybe even before they're happening, so that they were prepared to move as those industry trends started to sort of roll downhill. So this is not, the goal of these models is not to predict the future. There are models, like statistical models, that attempt to predict the future, where you put in data from today and it predicts based on the data from today, what will we see tomorrow, next year, and so on. And those can be useful. But this model that they go over in this chapter is for scenario planning and strategic thinking. It's not for predicting the future. It's for developing consistent stories about alternative futures. So consistent means that, you can imagine a bunch of different things you might just guess could happen. What the dynamical system model says is, of the million things you could guess that are happening, there's actually only 4 or 5 things that we imagine will happen based on the systemic factors that we think are at play inside the oil industry. We don't know what those 4 or 5 things are, and so we are going to build a model that lets us know what 4 or 5 things are sort of possible futures. So then when we're trying to prepare for what could possibly go on in the future, we don't have to prepare for a million different things could happen. We can prepare for these 4 or 5 different things. And a lot of times when you do this, those 4 or 5 different things that the model predicts could happen, there might be 2 or 3 of those that are not things that you actually thought were even possible. So that's kind of what they're talking about here. So like, I get a lot of my funding for my research from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. DARPA was founded when Sputnik was launched, and it went overhead and it surprised the American government. And so they then said, we need an agency to prevent surprise. And that is what strategic planning is all about. It's preventing surprise. All right, so in this particular case, the Shell could look back over a history of oil prices, and this was this figure 8.1 that starts this chapter out. And you see a lot of really interesting data here. This does not look like random data. So if this was just kind of everywhere, just oscillating up and down over this 100+ year period, then that might suggest that oil prices are just driven by random noise. There's no endogenous systemic factors driving oil prices. It's just driven by temperature or weather or something like that. But in reality, you see that there are periods that seem qualitatively similar and yet very dissimilar to other periods. So internally similar, but externally dissimilar. And so we can sort of focus on these periods and we can say, well, all right, so like in the beginning of the industry, there was huge volatility. And then we notice that if we just look back over the historical record, John D. Rockefeller manages to get control over a huge amount of oil that is put under Standard Oil. And at the instant that happens, then you notice the price fluctuations. And by the way, all these are in 2010 dollars. And so inflation is sort of already taken care of because these dollars have already been converted to the single currency of 2010 dollars. And so for this period, when Rockefeller controls the oil, you see these kind of oscillations that, again, are internally consistent, but very different from what happened before then. Then, after Standard Oil kind of, the sun sets on Standard Oil, this 7 groups that became known as the Seven Sisters in oil, which there were some comments in the perusal about, whether this is an appropriate name and all of that. Which is an interesting discussion, but they just happen to be, very well known as the Seven Sisters. If you look at oil history, these had a huge, these, even though they looked like 7 independent companies, they really worked together and together had access to a huge amount of oil. And they also had a lot of the operational lessons from Standard Oil back here in Rockefeller's time. And during that, then they ended up having this, almost no oscillations. Like there were these little jumps, but then you get these like very, very steady oil price over long periods of time. And then OPEC gets involved and it's a return to volatility. And even within that OPEC period, then you see periods where you get high volatility, you see periods where you get low volatility. And during those periods without the model, there were experts just purely using statistical models that had no dynamics in them. And those statistical models predicted price would stay low for the foreseeable future. And of course, then the foreseeable future happened and they didn't stay low. So that whole history there is what motivated Shell to say, can we, rather than just relying on statistics alone, can we try to think about a more systemic explanation, a systemic hypothesis that might be able to produce patterns like the ones that we've seen in history? And if we can manage to build a computer model that'll generate patterns similar to the ones we've seen in history, then that computer model can be like our Earth in a laboratory. It'll be kind of like our lab rat, where we can experiment on and see all the different ways that oil price and just the oil industry could possibly evolve in the future. Even though we don't know exactly which future will be our future, we know that our future might be one of the futures we can get in our kind of lab rat oil model that we end up building here. So that's the motivation behind this. So before we go into how we build such a hypothetical lab rat model, are there any questions about this motivation or about the history of this oil or anything like that? Is there anything I can help you with up to this point? And I should also note that although this chapter is all about oil, which is it's a very important, at least at this time in history, non-renewable natural resource, there are tons of non-renewable natural resources that we can get lessons from this study about, by thinking in the future. So oil is, super important now, but we say, okay, but we're going to convert to electric vehicles by whatever, we would think by the year 2300, it would be crazy if we had all internal combustion engines anymore, just based on what we know right now about market trends. So that's great. We all switched to electric vehicles. But then electric vehicles have batteries that use particular metals like lithium that become like the new oil. So it may be that we jump out of one non-renewable natural resource problems and into another. And who's to say now, and none of these resources are distributed everywhere around the earth. And so as you shift from one technology to another, you actually shift from depending on one part of the world to another part of the world. And so all of the lessons that we see from oil may end up being models that will help us strategically plan for when we have to deal with lithium mining issues in the future, for example. So as we're thinking about this, it's interesting looking backward. It's just kind of fun to look backward and think about oil, but also try to look forward. And dynamical models we build in the computer are models that help us thinking about oil, but oil is itself a model for us thinking about all other non-renewable natural resources. And I want to push you a little bit farther in the thinking too. You might know about current events that right now there is a giant container ship that, due to a dust storm in Egypt, got lodged in the Suez Canal and is currently blocking all traffic in the Suez Canal, which happens to be a canal which transports a lot of oil through Africa as opposed to around Africa. Now, these isthmuses, the Suez Canal, Panama Canal, these are important resources. We might not think of them as non-renewable natural resources like oil, but we manage, memes are being built about the Suez Canal thing too, right? And so these isthmuses or these passages end up becoming things on which we can get shifts in power. If you listen to, We Didn't Start the Fire, Billy Joel, he references trouble in the Suez. So if you look back in the history of Egypt, then you can see that there's been a lot of political strife related to the control of the Suez Canal. Similarly with the Panama Canal, these are this is a limited resource that the world cares about, that a small group of people can control. And that is exactly what we're talking about today with oil. And we can learn a lot from oil about these other things. And with global warming and climate change, then we're going to see the northern passages open up. We're going to see a fight for control of shipping routes that go through areas that in the past had impenetrable ice. Same thing over and over again. So whenever we talk about these models, remember, models are tools to help us understand what if questions. And these what if questions, the salient features of these what if questions are limited access to resources that are controlled by a small group of people that can use their control of those resources to exert power on others. And that is exactly what we're talking about today, and it's not just about oil. All right, so now that I have lectured over and over again about that, are there any clarifying questions or anything like that? So I was just trying to stall to see if any of you guys had questions before we move on to the details specific to oil. All right. Okay, great. All right, so we want to build a model of the oil market. And we want, and our major output variable is going to be price. We are trying to understand what causes price to move in these different patterns, to have huge volatility and times of durations of stability and so on and so forth. So if we focus on price, we can ask a simple question of how is price determined in a market? Now, those of you who've taken a microeconomics course, by the way, could I get a show of hands in the participants list or in the chat? How many of you have taken a microeconomics course in the past, either in high school or here in college? So again, I'll get the question here is, how many have taken a microeconomics course? And I saw one hand go up, chat or participants list answer. Okay, so just one so far? Okay. That's right. So there is at least one student here who's actually taken microeconomics with me. By the way, SOS 325, Economics of Sustainability. This has a lot of micro for sustainability. So those of you who, some of you will have to take SOS 325 as part of your bachelor's, other ones of you that'll be an elective. If you're interested in thinking about natural resources and natural resource management and the economics of these, and what drives people and all that, then I recommend taking a look at SOS 325. It's taught by a lot of different faculty. So basically, what if you ever take a microeconomics course, and you'll learn that microeconomics is basically the study of price. So microeconomics is does price get set in markets? So of course you can have governments that have strict control over price that say bread is exactly this. But if we don't live in one of those, if we live in a decentralized, a market is necessarily decentralized where the price is allowed to float. It's allowed to be set by buyers and sellers exchanging things together. And in markets, price is driven by gaps between supply and demand. If there is an excess of something you're trying to sell, you're not going to get someone to pay a lot because they can go to one of your competitors and your competitor will offer a little less than you and they will then get the sale. And then you can offer less than that competitor, and that problem, use a race to the bottom until eventually you get a low price that no one else can go lower than, and then that ends up being the price. Likewise, if there's very few, if there's low supply, then somebody who really needs that and can't find it anywhere else will be willing to pay anything for it, and then there'll be a race to the top. So gaps between supply and demand, oversupply and over demand are what drive prices up and down. And so if we think about that, then we can say, well, we've seen a system archetype that's been driven that involves gaps. Think about the temperature system in your house. You set a desired temperature, and if the temperature is less than that, then the heat turns on. If the temperature is more than that, then the air conditioning turns on, and that ends up driving the temperature down to the desired or up to the desired. But you have to wait when the, if the heat turns on, it doesn't immediately get up to that desired temperature. And so you have to wait. And then there might also be oscillations where as you heat up, then even when the heat turns off, then there might still be some latent heat that will cause temperature to keep rising. And then maybe the air will have to kick back on. And so you might end up getting these kind of oscillations. So what if we think about that, then so answering this question here, what system archetype have we heard about that involves things like the regulation of temperature in our homes, that involves gaps driving changes in system behavior over time? What archetype have we already seen that would be one that would be a candidate for putting in here? So what do you think? And it's not, and so I've seen drifting goals, and I think that is an interesting one there. Drifting goals would be great if we also are thinking about how we change our set point. So if we're heating the house up and it never quite gets to our goal, over time we might become, or it takes a really long time to get to our goal, then over time, our goal temperature, we might end up going down and saying, you know what, it's actually fine in here, I'm going to shift my goal down. But if we don't worry about our set, if we just assume the set point is saying, is there a simpler answer? So what archetype is even simpler than drifting goals that represents this idea of a gap between desired and actual, causing the system to either dump something in or pull something out in order to try to regulate the actual to the desired? It's a single feedback loop that I'm looking at for here. And in the leaky toilet example, it's actually, I'm looking for something even simpler than a leaky toilet example. I'm just looking for the toilet example. So what archetype just represents the toilet example without a leak? In other words, what is a toilet as it fills? And again, so escalation, that's a 2-loop archetype. What's a 1-loop archetype that describes a toilet or describes your temperature? All right, I'll put you guys out of your misery. So what I'm looking for here is just a simple balancing feedback loop with delay. So so that's all that, in your house, you've got a demand, which is so this demand for oil over here. This here is like the temperature set point in your house. And this supply of oil, this is like the actual temperature in your house. And this gap is the difference between the actual temperature and the desired temperature. And based on where that is, if the actual temperature is below or above, then you end up getting a signal which causes your heater to turn on. And then after your heater turns on, through some delay, it ends up actually changing the temperature of your house. So balancing feedback with delay. Similar in your toilet, if after the flush of the toilet water level is at 0, but your desired water level is at 15 centimeters down here, and the actual water level is down here at 0, so you detect a gap, and that gap causes a valve to pull water in to the toilet, but it can't immediately fill the toilet, so there's a delay, which eventually though causes the level to rise, and as the level rises, it closes that gap until eventually it settles out. So this is just the toilet example, the temperature example, and pretty much any microeconomic system, any price system it can be modeled, at least initially, as a balancing feedback loop with delay. So in this particular case, there is a demand for oil. This says, we all have to drive to work, and so we have a certain demand for oil. There is a certain amount of oil that is out there on the market. If there is too little oil that's on the market, so this gap here, you can think of this as, say, demand minus supply. And so you can imagine that if this is greater than 0, so demand is greater than supply, then that is going to cause the price of oil to go up. And so all of us will have to pay more for our gasoline. But with that high price, what's going to happen? Those oil providers are going to realize if they can sell a little bit more oil at this high price, they're going to make even more profits. So they are going to invest in putting in new wells in order to get more oil out. It takes, say 5 years or so to maybe put in all these new wells. And so that, so that delay is going to make it so that during these 5 years, supply is going to continually be less than demand. So price is going to stay high. After they've built all these wells and they start coming online, you start dumping in more supply. Initially, as you start dumping in more supply, those ones who get the supply out there sooner are going to be able to take advantage of the high price. But eventually, once there's enough additional supply, this gap is going to be reduced. And if the gap is reduced, then price will start coming down. And as price starts coming down, then they stop investing in new wells. But those previous investments end up eventually producing new wells, which might then generate an oversupply. That oversupply is going to generate prices that are even less, which might actually cause them to stop selling some of their barrels of oil to bring the price back up, and so on and so forth. So the question here in the chat, so if the gap reduces, the price reduces. So here, the way I've drawn the gap, demand minus supply, I would say that if this gap, I think I need a plus here. So the idea here is, which was like you said, if the gap reduces, the price reduces. Well, it's more like if the gap is large and positive, then the price is going to increase. If the gap is very negative, the price is going to decrease. So increases in the gap, so as the gap gets more positive, are going to be increases in oil price. Decreases in the gap, as the gap becomes negative, means decreases in oil price. And if the gap is 0, the oil price will stay the same, it won't change. So this is the basic idea of a balancing feedback loop that regulates price in any market, not just the oil market. Are there questions about that? Does that make sense, this idea of a balancing feedback loop? I'm mentioning this because some of you in your models might want to model commodities that themselves have price, and that price will end up driving behavior and consumption behavior in your models. You can use a loop like this to drive prices around. One of the criticisms of the early limits to growth model by Forrester is that he did not build price signals into his models. And so economists would say that as we run low on natural resources, prices are going to go up, which are ultimately going to change behavior. and change consumption behavior so that we maybe don't use as many of those natural resources. And so that wasn't modeled in those early limits to growth models, which made economists say they were alarmist, because in reality, you need some of these models built in. And that's what we're talking about here. You can build those in. You could build those in even if you're not modeling oil, because this doesn't have to be oil. This could be any commodity that's out there would have this exact same pattern. All right, so any questions about this pattern? This idea of balancing with delay being like the microeconomic example. All right, so with this sort of pattern, I'm going to call this the microeconomic hypothesis. And the microeconomic hypothesis here is that you will get natural oscillations in price, and so I could call this price over time, that are just due to the fact that you are going to periodically get gaps between supply and demand, and those gaps are going to take time to resolve. And that is going to lead to overcompensation. And that overcompensation is what drives these oscillations. And if this hypothesis was correct, then we would imagine that the average delay that you get here, let's say it takes 5 years to develop new oil capacity, is going to be closely related to the period of these oscillations that you would see in reality. That would be kind of a prediction of the microeconomic hypothesis here for oil prices. All right, before I move on to comparing this to the data from real oil, are there questions about this? I just want to make sure we have the basic general idea of price being driven by a feedback loop with delay. And again, I would call this a positive link, and I would call gap, I would say that's equal to demand minus supply. Where this up here is supply, and this down here is demand. There's a question in the chat. Would it be the supply of oil that companies have after drilling, or the overall supply of oil? Great question. I think it's the overall supply of oil. And so after drilling, they add supply. So this investment represents a marginal increase in supply. So if you have an investment here, so I guess we could label all these. If there was an increase in the investment for infrastructure, you would get an increase in supply. If you increase supply, that will narrow the gap because it's a minus S here. If you increase the gap, that will increase oil price. If you increase oil price, that will increase investment. So if we crawl around this here, we have one negative link around the loop, and that's what makes it a balancing loop or a negative feedback loop. So I can put a little negative here. Does that make sense? Does that answer those questions? Are there other questions? Okay, so how well does this microeconomic hypothesis, so basically, this is the kind of simplistic thinking here, right? So this is, you could say, you know what, I took a systems thinking class, we learned about balancing feedback with delay, and so maybe this explains all of oil, and we don't need to go any farther than this. So let's look at the data. So if we look at the data, initially this looks promising for the Rockefeller period. The Rockefeller period looks like you've got oscillations that may have some noise that are driven by exogenous factors that are maybe too, peculiar or idiosyncratic to the period for us to bother modeling with, but the general pattern seems to be there. But if we look at the actual time scale though, it suggests that the major oscillations here are pretty long. I mean, 1899 to 1919, like this kind of oscillation period looks more like 20 years than 5 years. And we're pretty sure that these oil wells can be developed a lot sooner than 5 years. There are kind of oscillations, maybe like this one, that look like they have a 5-year period. And so maybe we're kind of getting close there, but it feels like we're missing something, you know, that there are even slower oscillations that somehow we're missing. So maybe, you know, that's kind of the first issue with this simple microeconomic hypothesis. Let's put these little questions. Furthermore, if I look downstream a bit, there are periods with long regions of stability here where I don't see any oscillations at all. So this simple microeconomic hypothesis with this investment delay here, and I see the question, I'll get that in a second, this little delay here, which we think is due to this infrastructure capacity expansion delay, it doesn't seem to be doing what it's supposed to be doing in this region here. So that kind of makes us think that we're missing something. And then if I go a little bit farther, then there's still huge volatility that happens up here. And so it seems like I cannot explain this volatility relative to what I'm seeing over here. So it really seems like this simple one loop model is not going to do it for me. All right, so there's a question in the chat here. So during wars, when demand would be high, the suppliers would overhaul production. So that's a good question here. So there can be exogenous drivers. So war, for example. So when we build a dynamical model system, a dynamical systems model of oil, we probably aren't going to incorporate in the model when wars are going to happen. And so because we just don't know when wars are going to happen, we could build a model for how often wars occur and try to couple it in, but it's probably not going to be a very good model because wars occur due to all sorts of factors that may not have anything to do with oil. And so they'd be like really weird to like piece together. But what we can do, and like you said in the chat, is we can imagine creating a step response in demand. So we could go, if we build a model like this simple model here, we could, instead of making this a constant demand for oil, like a constant temperature set point, we could at certain times, turn this into a slider, for example. And we could say at particular times in our simulation, we are going to simulate a major world event like war that maybe will spike the demand for oil. And then we'll just take that slider and we'll drag it up. And we will see in the instant we drug that slider up, how did our model respond? And that would simulate what happened during, an event, an exogenous, an externally driven event like the start of a war. And then we can see exactly how suppliers would respond. We would think, based on this microeconomic model, that if demand increased, then oil price would spike. And as oil price spikes, then suppliers might start supplying oil. But we might be missing other things that occur during wartime, which a basic microeconomic model doesn't have here. Like, for example, the government might take over oil production and might shunt all of the oil to the military. And so the supply of oil to the market may be decoupled from the production of oil because all the oil will be going to the military and only a small quota will be going to the rest of the citizens, civilian citizens. So, if we're talking about specifically about wartime, we have to ask ourselves, do we need to make a wartime model that might be totally different? Just like when we get to the swing producer model, down in this, they had to come up with two modes of operation, the swing mode and the punitive mode. That's kind of like, wartime or not. It's like, that, the Oval Office, that carpet that's on the floor of the Oval Office where it's got the eagle holding the wheat or the arrows. And at times of war, they actually pull that carpet piece up and they change the eagle so its head is pointing towards the arrows. And during times of peace, they move the head around so it's pointing towards the wheat. It's kind of like the same thing with your war. You have to say, do I need to run my war model or my peacetime model? So does that answer the question there? Is that satisfactory, at least for now? Great. All right. So looking at this, we can see here that we're on the right track, that we have generated a mechanism that produces oscillations, but clearly it's not the whole story. So that's what Shell got together and said, can you build us, Morecroft and team, a better model that accounts for more than just a few of these 5-year oscillations? And that's when they pulled together a modeling team of diverse amounts of expertise, and they used the model as a way for them to pool their expertise and create a more interesting and more dynamic model. And that's what I'm calling the Opec control hypothesis instead of the simple microeconomic hypothesis. And this more complex model had 5 sectors, which they talked about in the chapter, and we'll go into in a little bit here. And these 5 sectors included a small portion over here, which was basically the microeconomic model. So we had independent producers, which we don't think have any control over the market. They are effectively enslaved to the market. That's kind of a terrible term to use. They are coupled to the market the same way we as consumers are coupled to the market. They don't have any choice. They just have to participate in a competitive market. There is no independent who has any control over price. And so on this side of the model, we use a basic microeconomic model. So this model will be built with stocks and flows, which basically are driven by supply and demand, and that's that's what's going on here. So the OPEC control hypothesis takes that microeconomic model and it bolts onto the side of it a really important supplier of oil that supplies huge amounts of oil to the point at which you can't view oil in the kind of competitive market. It's not a perfect competitive market anymore. It is a market that's been driven by a cartel, an oligopoly, and we need to model the decision making of that oligopoly that has such a huge market share that they basically can decide what price is going to be. They don't decide what price is going to be by sending out a letter saying this is the price for oil. They decide what price is going to be by dumping oil onto the market, causing that microeconomic loop to suddenly drive prices down, or they take huge amounts of oil that they already put on the market and pull them off the market. And by doing that, they create a gap in supply and demand, which drives prices up. And they can just dump oil on and pull oil off very rapidly without any worry about hurting their own economics back at home. And that was what gives them control over the market. And that's what's being modeled here. So in this OPEC control hypothesis, basically all the OPEC member states will get together, and this is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. And so that includes many Middle East countries as well as a few more that they get together and they set quotas and desired prices for OPEC production. And this is not done by this is not done necessarily for economic reasons. This can be done to advance the political agendas of everyone in OPEC. So that's kind of a key difference from the microeconomic hypothesis. There, price emerges from a bunch of consumers and producers just doing what's best for them in terms of consumption of oil. They don't have any control over anyone else. They're just trying to get to work. They're just trying to make money from people getting to work and so on and so forth. Here, OPEC is not necessarily trying to make money. Now they can control their own revenues into their country, but they also have the ability to change the amount of oil that is put onto the market in a way to put pressure on other countries that that might give them access to other resources. So it becomes more about the politics than the economics. Now, how do they do it? They've got a swing producer, and this, by the way, this term swing producer, this is a generic term that comes from the study in economics. When you study oligopolies, you learn that in an oligopoly, you typically have, sometimes you can get everyone to kind of perfectly agree in, an oligopoly is like a monopoly, but it's, but instead of having one producer that is controlling everything, you have like 5 producers that have got together and agreed to coordinate. Now, it's usually hard to get 5 producers to always agree. So what typically happens is you've got one so-called swing producer that has a huge amount of production. They control a huge amount of market share, and then everyone else around them controls a lot of market share, like enough market share to be interesting, but they pretty much count on the swing producer being the one that's controlling everything. And that swing producer in the case of oil is Saudi Arabia. And then later on, Russia became a big part of this. And so that swing producer can increase the total market supply at very little internal cost. They don't have to develop capacity. They don't even need to worry about their own internal revenues because they have so much extra money inside the country that even if they take a little bit of a hit in oil revenues, they're going to be doing just fine. So they can just use oil as a mechanism for controlling the rest of the world. So they have a fast acting feedback to ensure that oil price is buffered against any commercial market pressures. So they can just effectively choose what oil has to be. There's been a lot of news about the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States lately and interest rates. They are kind of like a swing producer in terms of interest rates. So if the Federal Reserve sees that interest rates are lower than it'd like to be, then it can pull money off the market, making money less available, or they can dump money onto the market, making money more available and making interest rates go down. So interest rates are kind of the price of money, and the Federal Reserve Bank is kind of like a swing producer that can control the price of money. They're more like a monopoly or something like that, but it's the same idea that they have fast acting feedback where they can dump money into the market or pull money out of the market, all trying to control interest rates at a set level. And so there was a comment in the chat like Amazon cutting prices so competitors can't afford to stay afloat. So that's an example of monopolistic competition. That's an excellent example where Amazon's maybe not interested in politics, but they're willing to take a cut on certain goods that they sell because they know that other competitors can't take that cut. So Amazon will control the price by maybe flooding the market with those things, killing their competitors. And once the competitors are gone, then maybe Amazon or some other giant market player will then be able to then maybe back off those policies and then start making money off of those goods without worrying about the competition from everyone else. So yeah, it's just an example where if you have a good in excess that others don't have, you might have the ability to gain control over those others. And then, like I mentioned, there are other members of OPEC that that play a role in OPEC decision making, and together have a very large market share, but they don't have enough of a market share to do as much damage as that swing producer does. And so they will always have a temptation to overproduce. And that is something a swing producer has to deal with. So let's say you've got 5 countries involved in this cartel. The swing producer produces, takes money off or takes oil out of the market, causing prices to rise. Well, any one of these other members of OPEC could secretly put more oil onto the market than agreed. And that tiny amount of oil they put on the market will sell at a high price. And they will, in the short term, increase their own country's revenue from oil. Now, the swing producer may not know who's doing that, but the swing producer will notice over time that the price of oil worldwide is lower than they tried to control it at. And the swing producer will initially pull more oil out of the market in order to try to raise the price. But when they notice that they've had to pull way more oil out of the market than they'd expect they'd have to do, then they will detect that someone, they don't know who, someone is overproducing beyond the agreed on amounts, and they will punish everyone because of that someone. And they punish everyone by flooding the market with oil, making the prices so low that it's going to hurt all of the other OPEC partners, as well as the rest of the world. And they do that for a long enough period of time that eventually all the partners get in line and they back off. And so that's kind of an example of altruistic punishment, where the OPEC swing producer ends up hurting itself just to hurt that one that's cheating. And that helps prevent cheating. So that is one way you can prevent cheating in a cartel, is have punishment by the swing producer. And that's something that we have to model. And so that is the overall view of the OPEC control hypothesis. In the last couple of slides here, I'm going to drill down into a few of these so we can actually see some of the stocks and flows that are used to make this whole simulation model go. But before we get there, I want to pause now to see, are there any questions? Does this coarse-grained perspective make sense? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. All right, so why don't we, if you're thinking about questions, let's stop here and do a little attendance question. And this one will be, I hope, an easy one. And I am going to say, who is the swing producer in OPEC? Or in other words, what country is the swing producer in OPEC? That's the attendance question at this point. So I'll leave that up there for a second. And again, there are other cartels for other goods, other commodities, and there are other swing producers. So I mean, so swing producer is a generic term for one of these entities that has a huge control over market share in a cartel or in an oligopoly. All right. So let's drill down and look at this model a little bit more. I'm not going to go into great detail here. The book doesn't go into as fine of a detail as it could, but if you look in the preface for the book, you can find instructions for getting all of the models that the book uses and downloading them and looking at them in a kind of read-only version of Stella called I Think that you can also download from that electronic resources webpage. And that electronic resource actually does have these models in it. If you want to drill down and see, you know, all of the detailed stock and flow models that they use for everything here. We're just going to look at a couple of kind of narrow things near the surface here. All right, so let's look at the kind of easier side of this, the microeconomic side, where we're just focusing on the independents and the basic market that they participate in. So we're going to zoom in here on the independent suppliers. These are the non-OPEC oil suppliers. They're called independents here because each individual does not collude with any of the other individuals. They just look at the current market price and they make decisions about how much they're going to supply based on that current market price. And you know, and that's it. So they're just responding to whatever price is there. They have no hope of controlling that price. They have to take the price at whatever it is. And so when we think about, you know, what's important to independence decision making, then there are a couple of parameters here that we may need to consult experts in order to figure out. So we need to maybe know, you know, what are the taxes they have to pay. We need to know how much does it cost for them to develop oil. We need to know what is the current oil price that comes from the market. So that's a dynamic variable that'll be plugged in from elsewhere. So this won't be something that comes from an expert. This will be connected to another part of the market or another part of the diagram. And then there's this optimism here. And so this is a parameter that we could maybe survey all of these independents. And so this term CapEx, this is just a short term for capital expansion. So this is this idea of a capacity expansion. So this is how optimistic are we that if we are to expand our capacity, that it's going to result in later on returns. So this is effectively a psychological parameter. So we could survey and say, you know, 9 out of 10 independents out there feel very optimistic right now. Well, we could put that psychological parameter into here, and then all of these things combine into here, along with this thing called a hurdle rate. And so this hurdle rate, basically all of these other things go in, and they allow you to predict an expected profit. And this hurdle rate is going to be what profit do you need to justify building more capacity. And if the expected profits are greater than the hurdle rate, then you are going to expand capacity. If the expected profits are less than the hurdle rate, then you're probably going to leave your capacity where it is. You're not going to invest in more capacity. So that's why it's called a hurdle rate. It's like a hurdle you have to jump over. As long as you can make it over the hurdle, then you expand your capacity. Otherwise, you don't expand capacity. So this is kind of like the causal loop diagram, project proposal perspective here. So once you take all those variables that you think are important, then you put them into a stock and flow diagram that might look like this one. And so the things you need to focus on in the stock and flow diagram are, well, for one, the stocks. And so we know that an important stock, because it changes over time, is the independence capacity. You know, how much capacity do they have to put together oil? And then we know that the independence capacity, there could be some capacity that is under construction that will eventually become capacity. So you can think of this as almost like in the SIR model, this is like the infectious population, and this is like the recovered population. And this, this on-stream rate is kind of like the average time it takes for someone to recover from disease. So this capacity in construction is like an individual waiting to be ready to participate back in society. And that's, you know, the kind of the model here. And so there's some other things that we'll talk about later, like the undeveloped reserves and things. But, you know, there's other stocks here as well that you could model here. This independence capacity is just a shadow variable for this independence capacity, just to make it so instead of having to draw a line going from here all the way over to here, you could create a shadow variable that's just a copy of this one so that it is a little cleaner in the diagram. And then all of those other things that I talked about on the previous graph, they just put those into formulas, which are captured by this coordinating network here, which ultimately calculates a profitability ratio, which is going to be the profitability you expect to get from building new capacity divided by the profitability you need to justify building new capacity. And if this profitability is higher than this hurdle rate, then you'll start building new capacity. That's what's going on here. And as I mentioned, a lot of these parameters require input from experts, domain experts. We are not oil experts. We don't know what the hurdle rate is for oil producers. We don't know what the optimism is. We might need to do surveys. Here, they implemented as a slider that we can play with. We don't know what the expected future oil price is. We need to ask experts for that. There's some things like this, upstream investment. This takes in the profitability ratio, and it turns into a capacity investment decision. And notice it's implemented as a lookup table. And so this is an example where we would ask experts, based on the profitability ratio, what would you expect the investment to be? And if the profitability ratio is less than 1, that means that you're under the hurdle rate. They might say we're not going to invest in that. But if it's 10% greater than the hurdle rate, they'd say, well, we might invest $1 million. If it's 30% greater than the hurdle rate, they might say we might invest $5 million, and so on. So you could build a lookup table which captures this survey data, where you go to a domain expert and you say, based on these different profitability ratios, how much would you personally decide you wanted to invest? And then maybe we take an average over all those domain experts and then encode that as a lookup table. And that's how we would build the independence decision making. All right, any questions about that? It's likewise for these lookup tables down here too. All right, so then once we know how the independents are making their decisions, we need to say, well, then how does price end up changing over time? Because price will end up feeding into those independence decisions. And so again, we're just going to use a simple microeconomic model for this, balancing feedback with delay. And so this is kind of a cartoonish version, but this is basically the stock and flow model that we are going to build. And so we have a demand for oil, which is a stock because it changes over time. And we have the current oil price. Now, you might not think of price as a stock, but because price changes over time, we use a stock to represent it, and that allows it to vary. So then anything that varies is going to have flows, and these flows, we're just going to name them generically as change in the stock, change in demand, change in price. And so, you know, we could say, well, what causes changes in price? Well, changes in price are, we've got total production, that is supply, and we've got total demand, that's this thing coming in here. So effectively, this is the gap. So that's the gap there, or allows us to calculate the gap. So that's me trying to write gap, which is right over here. And so that will allow me to calculate a change in price. It will take time for that price to actually happen. So you can almost think of this flow as implementing a kind of smoothing delay, where you're going to have sort of expected changes in price and then the slow actual changes in price that happen inside the stock. Then that price here gets fed into demand. And so we know that that due to the effect of the global economy, so there's that realistic term here, this effect of the global economy, that is going to affect demand. So if there's a war, that might affect demand. If it's peace, that might affect demand. There's going to be some background level of demand, which may or may not change with the model as it runs. And that is going to interact with the current price. And so if the prices are high, over a slow time scale, that might actually change demand. This might help explain those slow oscillations during the Rockefeller time, because you might actually be seeing people adjusting their use patterns at a 20-year cycle. And so you have a 5-year cycle, which has to do with CapEx investment, and at a 20-year cycle, it has to do with behavioral changes. And so those prices feed back in and change demand. And then ultimately, that changes the actual demand for oil, which is kept as this stock here. So that's the basic independent and microeconomic models combined together. Any questions about that? And again, this sort of module, even though we've written it for oil, it could be generalized, because there's a whole lot of other commodities out there that maybe don't have oligopolies controlling them, that you build a model really, really similar to this one to model the changes in prices of those things. Maybe cars, maybe that's one of them, or cell phones. You could build independent producers of cell phones, you could build price and demand of cell phones, and through this model, you might end up recapitulating cell phone trajectory prices over time. Okay. All right, so then let's focus on the more exciting part of this, that is more specific to oils or oligopoly in general, and that's a modeling of OPEC. And so we mentioned that the really important member of the cartel, that sort of, if it wasn't for the other members that had a big enough market share to be interesting, but not big enough to be the swing producer would effectively be a monopolist. They would just control everything. But because there are the others that joined OPEC that have enough market share that they can, that they prevent the swing producer from taking complete control over the world oil market, then we have to worry about them too. But the swing producer is kind of like is the monopolist of the group. And they can choose to switch between two types of behavior, as I already mentioned before. There's the swing mode, and in the swing mode, they basically look and they have an intended price. This is like the thermostat, this is the price they want the world oil price to be in. And they then watch the real price, and then they look at the gap between the two. And based on the gap between the two, then a simple negative feedback loop changes whether they dump oil onto the market or they take oil out of the market. And so then this will end up effectively being a balancing feedback loop that tries to regulate the market oil price to the intended oil price, just like the Federal Reserve Bank dumps money onto the market or takes money out of the market to regulate interest rates. It's just a balancing feedback loop. Now, and the other side of things, when the swing producer detects that one of the OPEC member states must be dumping more oil onto the market than they're allowed to, the swing producer initially tries to pull oil off the market to compensate. But eventually, once they've pulled enough oil off the market that they say somebody is cheating here, then they flip into what will effectively be like a reinforcing feedback loop, if not totally decoupled. And so the idea here is that they will start flooding the market with oil up until the point where the price falls to this punitive price. And so this is kind of the lowest price they're willing to allow the oil market to go to. But up until then, they just keep flooding the market with it until they can detect that the other producers who have been adding extra oil to the market stop. And once that happens, then they flip back into swing mode and then regulate the price back up to where it was supposed to be. So they're not regulating to the punitive price, but the punitive price is the lowest they're willing to go before they stop. It's kind of like in the Federal Reserve, they can't go any lower than 0% interest. They probably can't get lower than 0.1% interest. So eventually they just lose power, and they have to stop dumping money, and they have to look for other ways to control the market. So that's the punitive mode, where you flip out of the balancing and into kind of a reinforcing feedback, where they just cause a low price to get even lower and lower and lower until the cheater who was making the lower price lower stops cheating. So there's like a prisoner's dilemma that's going on there. And then there's the quota setting and allocation that we can model. Those basically have some sort of simple dynamics here, where we can build some formulas where they have an agreed quota at a particular time, and then based on biases that we can put in that allow us to sort of introduce external forces that sort of change the bias, like based on certain political forces, the cartel will feel more powerful or less powerful, then that will end up allowing this quota to change over time. And then they've also got their own negotiation and allocation, deciding on how much the opportunists produce and how much the swing producer produce. And so we can model that in a coordinating network as well. And so the last thing that we need to model in this is the cheating behavior. And the way that is modeled in here is they have a little lookup table, which basically has to do with what is the likelihood of cheating. And the idea here is if the gap between desired price and actual price is near zero, there is a high probability of the opportunists putting their surplus oil onto the market, because when things are going well, the swing producer is not going to be able to tell that there is a slight deviation away from the desired price. But when the desired price, and you can think of this in dollars per barrel, gets much less than when the actual price gets much less than the desired price, then in that case, we model the swing producer as being able to detect and will be very likely to kick into punitive mode. And so in that case, the opportunists will be very unlikely to make use of their surplus oil and put it onto the market. So this little lookup table is just modeling the psychology of the opportunists. All right, so that's all of OPEC. And then the only other things we might want to add, and I'm just going to quickly tab through this so I have time for a few questions, is that over time, Russia might become important as the USSR breaks up, for example. And so we need to figure out how Russia is going to play a role. And Russia effectively provides more reserves for the independents to potentially use. And so we can then build a little kind of SIR model. So you can think of this as SIR, or you can think of each one of these as like smoothing delays, where you have the Russian reserves that people are skeptical of, but over time, they become less skeptical of. And then they become secure reserves that over time get adopted and purchased by the independents. So they have agreed to rights here, and then become a part of the independence reserve. So it looks just like a delayed, an age structured model in a population, where Russian oil gradually over time becomes independence oil as it becomes more secure. And then that will give the independents more ability to participate in the market. So we have a complete picture, is very complex, tons of feedback loops, and produces a ton of really cool behaviors. And I'm only going to show you one of these that's from the end of the book where I didn't tell you, or end of the chapter where I didn't tell you had to read. But this is an example where this came out of that model, a trajectory like this, where you have a smooth oil price here that kind of rises a little bit, and then it starts engaging in wild oscillations. And that occurs at this point here when there are punitive actions by the swing producer. So basically what's happening here is we are watching the opportunists here take advantage of the current situation, but then at this instant, the swing producer stops tolerating it and starts swinging into punitive mode. And when they punish, that ends up sending the oil price down. which then causes the opportunists to back off, which then sends the oil price up. But then that might cause some of the opportunists to still come back in, which sends the things back down, and you get these wild oscillations. And it sort of matches some of the patterns that we see in real history here. So it looks to us like this is starting to be able to generate trajectories that actually look like real history. And as the book talks about, there are tons of other scenarios that they then use this exact same model to play with, to then better understand the types of future histories that you might get in future oil prices here. So this was kind of a validation step. So this validated that the model can produce trajectories we've seen before. And once we validated that it can produce trajectories we've seen before, then we trust that when we play with this model like a kind of a lab rat, that the trajectories we see coming out of our lab rat might actually map to the physiology of the world global market, so that we might then be able to better plan for what's going to happen in reality. All right, so that's all I've got for you today. I just want to leave these announcements up here. I already kind of went over these. Chapter 9, I just want to mention that in perusal, when you get to the end of the first section, because I tell you to skip these 2 sections, there's a little button at the very end of that that says continue to next section, because I basically tell you can read a little bit and then a little bit more, but they're separated. I have you skip a middle part. Make sure to click the skip to the next section so you don't accidentally only read half of it and not get full credit for the perusal assignment. And then there's chapter 10, which will be due before lecture F3. And then there's these, which I went over. So that's all I've got for you today. I'm happy to take any questions. Let me put the last attendance question up. And that question will be, what is the basic system archetype that describes the setting, describes the trajectory of prices in a market? And this is standard microeconomics. Standard microeconomic theory. So what system archetype have we used time and time again throughout the class so far that best describes the oscillations that we see in prices? And I'll put that URL in the chat again. All right, so if you don't have any questions for me, you can feel free to head out. I do have office hours. You can also feel free to come to those. Otherwise, I'm happy to take a couple questions here. And thanks, Dexter is doing fine. He's north of 50 pounds now, so still a growing boy.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
You too. Yes, if your group needs any help, then it's fine for everybody to come to office hours. And then just, I admit one student in at a time, just in case somebody's got a private issue. But then, so when you come in, you can say, oh, by the way, my group members are in the waiting room, and then I'll admit them in too. Okay, looks like everybody's out. So I will head out, and I'll be starting office hours in a few minutes, no later than 4:30. Yeah.
I have a quick question, sorry.
Sure.
You said it earlier, but I'm literally, I don't know. I'm just blanking. I'm just trying to remember the archetype you said earlier. It's the one loop or the one loop balancing, and I just can't remember the name.
Well, that's all I'm really looking for. Balancing with delay.
Okay, balancing with delay. Okay. Sweet. Thank you.
Yep.
That in the swing producer, I literally just started this year, like, I don't know, because it was a big thing like earlier this year. You probably heard about it. Just like I just started getting to the stock market, so a lot of this class, like, I don't know, it's just on my head, so I literally relate a lot of it to